You're standing in the grand entrance hall of Versailles, surrounded by glittering chandeliers and marble columns that reach toward painted ceilings depicting angels and gods. The opulence is breathtaking, almost overwhelming in its beauty. But as you admire the golden details and pristine artwork, you notice something that makes your blood run cold. There, carved discreetly into the marble baseboards, are tiny scratches, desperate fingernail marks left by someone who was dragged screaming through these very halls. Those scratches tell a story that the tour guides will never share with you. Behind the magnificent facades of history's greatest palaces, behind the silk tapestries and crystal goblets, existed punishment systems so savage and creative that they would make medieval torture chambers seem merciful by comparison. The same hands that commissioned breathtaking art and architecture also designed chambers of suffering that pushed human cruelty to its absolute limits. You see, when you possess absolute power over life and death, when you control the fate of thousands with a mere gesture, ordinary punishment seems inadequate. How do you discipline someone when execution is too quick, when banishment is too kind? The answer lies in the twisted ingenuity of royal minds that had centuries to perfect the art of making people suffer while keeping them alive to suffer more. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. What you're about to hear isn't just a catalogue of historical cruelties. These are real methods used by real people in positions of ultimate authority, techniques refined over generations and passed down like family recipes for human misery. The victims weren't fictional characters, but living, breathing individuals whose only crime was often nothing more than catching the wrong person's attention at the wrong moment. The palace punishment system operated on a principle that modern psychology would recognize as sophisticated psychological warfare. Physical pain was just the beginning. The real artistry lay in breaking the human spirit so completely that victims would beg for death while simultaneously doing everything in their power to avoid it. This wasn't random violence born of anger or passion. This was calculated, methodical, and designed to send messages that would echo through the palace corridors for generations. Let's begin with the Palace of the Purple Chamber in Constantinople, where Byzantine emperors perfected what they called the art of prolonged correction. The Byzantines understood something that crude executioners never grasped, that the anticipation of pain could be more devastating than pain itself, and that hope could be weaponized just as effectively as any blade or flame. The punishment began with what they called the ceremony of descent. The condemned would be brought before the emperor in full court regalia, surrounded by hundreds of courtiers dressed in their finest silks and jewels. The contrast was deliberate and psychologically devastating. Here was the victim, about to lose everything, surrounded by people living in unimaginable luxury who would watch their destruction as entertainment would rear. The emperor at the charges with theatrical, his voice ex-gravity, owing through marble halls designed to amplify every word. But here's where the Byzantine genius for cruelty revealed itself. The sentence was never fully explained. The victim knew they were about to suffer, but the exact nature of that suffering remained a mystery that their imagination would fill with increasingly horrific possibilities. From the throne room, they were led through a series of chambers, each more ominous than the last. The first chamber was actually quite pleasant, furnished with comfortable chairs and decorated with beautiful frescoes. Guards would offer the condemned food and wine, speaking kindly to them, asking about their families. This wasn't mercy, it was psychological manipulation. The kindness made what came next even more shocking. The second chamber introduced the first element of genuine fear. Here, They would be shown the instruments that might be used in their punishment. Not crude tools of obvious torture, but elegant devices crafted by master artisans. A golden chair with hidden spikes, a silk rope that looked decorative but could tighten with mechanical precision. A beautiful chalice that could be heated to temperatures that would sear flesh from bone. The guards would explain each device in clinical detail, discussing their various functions like art critics examining masterpieces. But still, the victim didn't know which, if any, of these devices would be used on them. The uncertainty was the first real punishment, more effective than any physical pain in breaking down psychological resistance. The third chamber was where the Byzantines revealed their true mastery of human psychology. This room was filled with former prisoners who had survived various punishments. Some were missing fingers, others bore intricate scars that formed patterns across their skin. A few had been blinded in one eye, the other left intact, so they could see their own reflection and remember what they'd lost. These survivors would surround the new prisoner, not to threaten, but to share their stories. They would describe their punishments in vivid detail, explaining how each sensation felt, how long it lasted, how they begged for mercy that never came. But here was the twist that made this so psychologically devastating. They would also talk about how they survived, how they endured, how life was still possible after unimaginable suffering. This gave the new prisoner hope, while simultaneously filling them with dread. They could survive whatever was coming, which meant the punishment could be as severe as the emperor desired without risking death. Hope became another instrument of torture. The fourth chamber was where the actual punishment began, but even this followed the Byzantine principle of psychological manipulation over simple physical pain. The condemned would be strapped to a device that looked far than it more threatening actually was. A chair covered in watiques, but appeared to be sharp SP, were actually dull points that would press into the skin without breaking it. The real punishment was administered through a series of small, precise injuries that were painful but not life-threatening. A heated pin pressed into the palm, a thin blade used to make shallow cuts that would sting for days but heal without permanent damage. Drops of scalding wax applied to sensitive areas. Each individual element was bearable, but the combination and the uncertainty about when it would end created a form of suffering that many victims described as worse than death. The genius of this UNP system was its predictability. Some sessions would last minutes, others would continue for hours. Sometimes the victim would be returned to their cell after only minor discomfort. Other times, they would endure genuine agony. The randomness made it impossible to prepare mentally or emotionally for what was coming. But the Byzantines saved their most sophisticated cruelty for the fifth and final chamber. This was where they administered what they called the gift of memory. The victim would be brought before a skilled artist who would create a detailed portrait of them at the moment of their greatest suffering. Every line of pain in face, their every tear, every expression of despair would be captured with masterful precision. These portraits weren't hidden away in dungeons. They were displayed in the palace galleries alongside paintings of saints and emperors, labeled with the victim's name and crime. Visitors would admire them as of art, while works the subjects, if they survived, would be forced to walk past their own images of ultimate humiliation the rest of their lives. The psychological impact was devastating and permanent. Even if their physical wounds healed completely, victims could never escape the reminder of their lowest moment, immortalized in oil and displayed for the entertainment of others. They became living ghosts, haunting the same halls where their dignity had been stripped away and preserved forever in paint. This system of punishment was so effective that many victims would do anything to avoid returning to those chambers. They became the most loyal servants of the very system that had destroyed them, informing on potential troublemakers and competing with each other to demonstrate their unwavering devotion to the emperor who had orchestrated their suffering. The Byzantine system was just the beginning of a dark evolution in palace punishment. As news of these techniques spread through diplomatic channels and royal marriages, other courts began developing their own variations, each trying to outdo the others in psychological sophistication and creative cruelty. In the forbidden city of Beijing, the Ming dynasty emperors created what they called the Chamber of Eternal Reflection. Unlike the Byzantine focus on physical discomfort combined with psychological manipulation, the Chinese approach was purely mental torture elevated to an art form that would leave victims begging for the simplicity of physical pain. The chamber itself was a masterpiece of architectural psychology. Perfectly circular, with no corners where the eye could rest, it was painted in a shade of white so pure and uniform that it created the illusion of infinite space. The floor was polished to mirror perfection, doubling the disorienting effect. But the real genius lay in the ceiling, which was covered in thousands of tiny mirrors, arranged in geometric patterns that would catch and reflect light in ways that made it impossible to determine the source of illumination. Victims would be placed in the center of this room, chained to a chair that was itself a work of art, carved from a single piece of jade and designed to be comfortable enough that physical discomfort wouldn't distract from the mental anguish. They would be left alone in this space for periods that could last days or weeks, with no human contact except for silent guards who would bring food and water at irregular intervals. The punishment wasn't isolation itself, though that was certainly part of it. The true torture came from what the Chinese called the dissolution of self. In a space where there were no reference points, no way to judge distance or time, no shadows to indicate the passage of hours, victims would begin to lose their sense of reality. The mirrors on the ceiling would create phantom movements in their peripheral vision, shapes that would disappear when looked at directly. After just a few days, most prisoners would begin talking to themselves, creating imaginary conversations to fill the silence. The guards were instructed to listen carefully to these monologues, taking detailed notes about what the victims revealed about their thoughts, fears, and secrets. This information would later be used against them, creating the psychological impression that the emperor could read their minds. But the Chamber of Eternal Reflection had an even more insidious purpose. The perfectly smooth surfaces and absence of any texture or variation would gradually cause what modern neuroscience would recognize as sensory deprivation psychosis. Hallucinations would begin as whispers at the edge of hearing, progressing to full conversations with people who weren't there. Visual distortions would make victims see their own reflections as separate entities, leading to one-sided arguments with mirror images that seemed to move independently. The most devastating aspect was what happened when victims were finally released. After weeks in the featureless chamber, the normal world would seem impossibly complex and overwhelming. Colors would be too bright, sounds too loud, textures too rough. Many former prisoners would actually request to return to the chamber, finding the chaos of normal life unbearable compared to the stark simplicity of their white prison. The Chinese documented these effects with scientific precision, creating detailed records of how long it took different types of people to break down and what specific symptoms appeared at each stage. They discovered that scholars and intellectuals, people accustomed to complex thinking, would succumb fastest to the sensory deprivation. Simple farmers or laborers, whose minds were used to basic, concrete tasks, could sometimes last weeks longer before showing signs of psychological collapse. This knowledge was weaponized in ways that revealed the true sophistication of palace punishment systems. Political prisoners would be subjected to periods in the chamber carefully calculated to bring them to the edge of madness without pushing them over completely. They would emerge psychologically shattered, but still functional enough to serve as examples to others. Moving west to the Palace of Versailles, Louis XIV's court developed what they euphemistically called the theatre of correction, a system that combined public humiliation with private torment in ways that turned punishment into elaborate performances designed to entertain the nobility while destroying the victims. The French understood that in a culture obsessed with status and appearance, social death could be more devastating than physical death. Their punishments were designed not just to cause suffering, but to permanently destroy the victim's place in society, making them living examples of what happened to those who crossed the Sun King. The theater of correction would begin with what they called the Parade of Shame. The condemned would be dressed in specially designed costumes that looked elegant from a distance, but revealed their true nature upon closer inspection. A beautiful gown might be sewn with tiny bells that would ring with every movement, making silence impossible. A handsome coat might have sleeves that were sewn together, preventing the wearer from using their hands normally. These costume modifications were crafted by the same seamstresses who created clothing for the royal family, ensuring that the humiliation was administered with the same attention to detail that went into court finery. The victims would be paraded through the palace during the busiest social hours, forced to participate in normal court activities, while their modified clothing made every action awkward and embarrassing. But the true genius of the French system lay in what they called social poisoning. Instead of simply excluding the punished person from court life, they would be included in everything, but in ways designed to maximize their humiliation. They would be invited to dinner parties, but seated at a special table where the food was deliberately oversalted or underseasoned. They would be asked to dance at balls, but only to music that was played slightly too fast or too slow, making graceful movement impossible. The courtiers were instructed to treat these punishments as amusing entertainment, laughing at the victim's difficulties while maintaining the pretense of social politeness. This created a psychological environment where the victim could never be sure whether people were genuinely trying to help them or secretly mocking their struggles. The French also pioneered what they called temporal punishment, using time itself as an instrument of torture. Victims would be required to perform specific tasks at precise moments throughout the day, but they would never be told exactly when these moments would occur. They might be required to bow whenever they heard a particular bell, but the bell would ring at random intervals, sometimes multiple times per minute, sometimes not for hours. This created a state of constant vigilance and anxiety that was more exhausting than any physical labor. Victims would become hyper-aware of every sound, every movement around them, never able to relax or let their guard down. The psychological strain would accumulate over months until many prisoners would collapse from sheer mental exhaustion. The most diabolical aspect of the French system was how it corrupted the victim's own memories and relationships. Family members and friends would be secretly instructed to alter small details in their interactions, using slightly different names, referencing events that never happened, or denying conversations that had actually taken place. This technique, which the French called the erosion of certainty, was designed to make victims question their own sanity. Imagine trying to maintain your grip on reality when everyone around you insists that your childhood dog was named Pierre when you clearly remember it being called Claude. Picture the growing panic as your own sister claims you never had a brother when you have vivid memories of growing up with him. The French courtiers would execute these deceptions with theatrical precision, maintaining detailed scripts to ensure consistency in their lies. The victims would find themselves caught in an impossible situation. They could either accept that their memories were false, which would destroy their sense of self, or insist on their version of reality, which would make them appear increasingly unstable to observers. Either choice served the punishment's purpose of psychological destruction. But perhaps the most chilling innovation at Versailles was what they called the mirror of futures. Victims would be shown elaborate plans for their eventual release and restoration to society. They would be given detailed descriptions of the life waiting for them, the house they would live in, the position they would hold, the friends who were eager to welcome them back. These weren't genuine offers, but cruel fantasies designed to give hope that could then be systematically destroyed. The condemned would be allowed to plan for this imaginary future, to write letters to the people they would see again, to design the clothes they would wear to their freedom celebration. Court artists would even paint portraits showing them in their restored position, looking healthy and happy, and surrounded by loved ones. Then, just as the victim began to believe in the possibility of redemption, these dreams would be revealed as elaborate lies. The house existed only in paintings. The position had been filled by someone else. The friends had forgotten their name entirely. The psychological crash from hope to despair was so severe that many victims never recovered their ability to hope for anything again. This technique was so effective that some prisoners would actually resist genuine offers of release, convinced that they were simply more elaborate versions of the mirror of futures designed to torment them further. They had been so thoroughly broken by false hope that they could no longer recognize real opportunities for freedom. The Spanish court at the Escorial developed their own variation, which they called the mathematics of suffering. Spanish court officials, influenced by their empire's emphasis on precise record-keeping and bureaucratic efficiency, approached punishment with the same methodical attention to detail they applied to managing colonial territories. They created elaborate charts and calculations to determine the exact amount of suffering needed to achieve specific behavioral changes. Different crimes received different formulas, with variables for the prisoner's social status, age, gender, and psychological profile. A nobleman who spoke against the king might receive precisely 47 hours of a particular punishment, while a servant sent whole food would endure exactly 23 hours of a different technique. This mathematical precision extended to the punishments themselves. The Spanish developed devices that could administer pain in carefully measured doses. A mechanical press that would apply exactly 50 pounds of pressure to a victim's hand. A heating device that could raise the temperature of metal objects to within 1 degree of a predetermined level. Timing mechanisms that could control the duration of various torments down to the minute. The psychological effect of this precision was devastating in its own unique way. Victims knew that their suffering wasn't the result of anger or passion, but of cold calculation. Every moment of pain had been planned, and measure more than variables to nothing them'd, reducing in an equation of human misery. The Spanish also pioneered what they called inherited punishment. The effects of a sentence wouldn't end with the original victim, but would be passed down through their generations. Children family line 4 of the condemned would face restrictions on their movements, their marriages, their careers. Their grandchildren would find certain doors forever closed to them, certain opportunities permanently beyond their reach. This created a form of genetic punishment that extended the original victim's suffering far beyond their own lifetime. Parents would be forced to watch their innocent children pay the price for crimes they had never committed, adding the agony of generational guilt to their immediate physical torment. The records from the Escorial reveal punishment sentences that stretched across centuries, with detailed instructions for how each generation should be treated differently while maintaining the overall pattern of systematic disadvantage. Some families carried these inherited punishments for so long that the original crime was forgotten, but the consequences continued to shape their descendants' lives. In the Ottoman palaces of Istanbul, the sultans developed what they called the Garden of Living Statues. This punishment was reserved for those whose crimes were considered particularly offensive to imperial dignity. Victims would be subjected to a process that left them physically intact, but psychologically transformed into something less than human. The process began with months of isolation in chambers where every surface was covered in mirrors. Unlike the Chinese system of sensory deprivation, this was sensory overload designed to fracture the victim's sense of identity. They would see themselves reflected infinitely in every direction, unable to distinguish between their real body and the countless reflections surrounding them. Guards would periodically enter these mirror chambers to pose the victim in different positions, standing with arms raised, kneeling in supplication, lying prostrate on the floor. They would be required to hold these poses for hours while studying their reflections, forced to see themselves from every angle in positions of submission and defeat. After months of this conditioning, victims would be moved to the garden itself, where they would join dozens of other human statues positioned throughout the landscaped grounds. They would be required to hold specific poses for the entertainment of court visitors, moving only when signaled by guards and only to assume new positions of display. The psychological conditioning was so complete that most victims would maintain their assigned poses even when unobserved. They had been transformed into living art objects, conscious but compliant, aware of their humanity but unable to express it. Visitors to the palace would stroll through the garden, admiring the human statues as they would any other decorative element, sometimes not even realizing they were looking at living people. The most disturbing aspect of this punishment was how it affected the victims' families. Loved ones would be invited to visit the garden, where they would see their relatives transformed into motionless decorations. They were forbidden from speaking to the human statues or acknowledging their former relationship in any way. The psychological torture extended to everyone who had ever cared about the victim, forcing them to witness the complete dehumanization of someone they loved while pretending not to recognize them. These palace punishment systems shared certain characteristics that reveal the sophisticated understanding their creators had of human psychology. They were designed to be memorable, creating experiences so traumatic that they would serve as warnings to others for generations. They were also designed to be social, involving the broader court community in ways that corrupted everyone who participated, making the entire palace complicit in the victim's destruction. Most importantly, they were designed to be permanent. Physical wounds heal, but psychological trauma endures. These punishments created walking reminders of royal power, broken people who would carry their suffering for the rest of their lives and pass the memory of it and to their children, grandchildren. The techniques developed in these palace chambers weren't simply expressions of individual cruelty, but sophisticated tools of social control. They sent clear messages about the consequences of challenging authority, while simultaneously entertaining class, the unruling binding them together through shared participation in systematic cruelty. These palace punishment systems represent something far more chilling than simple cruelty. They reveal the terrifying creativity that emerges when absolute power meets unlimited time and resources. The scratches in those marble baseboards at Versailles weren't carved by random violence or momentary rage. They were the desperate marks of human beings caught in machines of suffering so sophisticated that they turned psychological destruction into an art form. What makes these stories so haunting isn't just the individual techniques, but how they were refined across cultures and centuries, passed between royal courts like trade secrets. Each empire took the lessons learned by others and added their own innovations, creating an evolution of cruelty that pushed the boundaries of what one human being could inflict upon another while keeping them alive to suffer more. These weren't the products of madness or primitive brutality. They were created by educated, cultured people who commissioned beautiful art and wrote poetry about love and honor. The same minds that designed soaring cathedrals and composed symphonies also engineered chambers where hope itself became a weapon and memory could be turned into a prison. The victims of these punishments, the people who carved those desperate scratches into marble, who broke down in chambers of mirrors, who became living statues in Ottoman gardens, they deserve to be remembered not just as cautionary tales, but as human beings who endured unimaginable suffering. Their stories remind us that behind every beautiful palace, every golden age of art and culture, there may be foundations built on carefully hidden cruelty. The next time you walk through those glittering halls of power, whether they're ancient palaces turned into museums or modern institutions draped in marble and gold, remember to look for the scratches in the baseboards, because the true measure of any civilization isn't found in its monuments to beauty, but in how it treated those who had no power to resist.